The rain fell in thin, gray sheets, washing the color from the tired town of Oakhaven. It slicked the asphalt of Main Street and beat it on the large plate glass window of the Anchor, a diner that felt more like a shipwreck than a harbor. Inside, Alara traced the rim of a coffee cup, her reflection a pale, wavering ghost in the dark liquid. The place was empty again, a hollow echo of the laughter and life it had once held. The worn red vinyl of the booths was cracked like old leather, and the air, usually thick with the comforting scent of bacon and coffee, smelled faintly of damp and despair. Only one customer sat hunched over the counter, a tourist who had mistaken the diner's emptiness for rustic charm. He had ordered the daily special, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and was now pushing it around his plate with a look of profound disappointment. "Is this supposed to be hot?" he asked, his voice loud in the funereal quiet. He prodded a lump of potato as if it were a dead thing. Alara's hands tightened on her dishcloth. "It was made fresh this morning, sir." Her voice was soft, worn smooth by years of quiet endurance. "Fresh," he scoffed, a theatrical sound that ricocheted off the tiled walls. "Lady, this tastes like it was made last Tuesday. And the meatloaf? What is this, cat food?" A flush of heat crept up Alara's neck. It was David's recipe. Her late husband had perfected it, proud of the specific blend of herbs he used. It was the first thing he had taught her to cook when they opened the Anchor together, his large, gentle hands guiding hers. Now, this stranger was shredding that memory with casual cruelty. She wanted to tell him that, to explain that the food was simple but honest, made with what little she could afford. But she said nothing. She simply nodded, her gaze dropping to the scuffed linoleum floor. "I can get you something else," she offered, the words tasting like ash. "No thanks. I've lost my appetite." He stood, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the counter, not nearly enough to cover the meal. "You should think about closing up shop. Put this place out of its misery." He walked out, the little bell above the door chiming a mocking farewell. Alara stood motionless, the man's words hanging in the air like poison. He was right, of course. The diner was failing. Every unpaid bill, every empty stool was a testament to that fact. But it was all she had left of David. Closing it would be like burying him all over again. Just as the silence threatened to swallow her whole, a commotion erupted outside. A woman, her face a mask of raw panic, was running down the sidewalk, her sobs torn from her throat. Her hair was soaked, plastered to her cheeks, and her thin jacket was no match for the biting wind. She stumbled, catching herself on a lamppost, her desperate eyes scanning the street. At the far end of town, parked under the flickering neon of the closed-down cinema, was a line of motorcycles. They were huge, gleaming machines of chrome and black steel, their riders hulking silhouettes in the gloom. Hell's Angels. Their presence in Oakhaven for the past week had been a source of uneasy whispers and shuttered windows. The woman, seeing them, seemed to find a last reserve of strength. She pushed off the post and ran towards them, her cries for help swallowed by the wind and the rain. From her doorway, Alara watched. Other faces appeared in the windows of the neighboring shops. The baker, the hardware store owner, the librarian. All watching, their expressions a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They were silent observers, trapped behind glass. The woman reached the bikers, her hands outstretched in a desperate plea. But the men didn't move. They sat on their bikes, impassive, their faces obscured by the shadows, looking like stone gargoyles unmoved by the storm or the woman's anguish. One of them slowly, deliberately, lit a cigarette, the flare of the match a brief, defiant spark in the twilight. They seemed to be the very embodiment of indifference. The woman's shoulders slumped in defeat, her sobs finally dissolving into the sound of the falling rain. The curtains on Main Street slid shut, one by one, leaving Alara alone to bear witness to the quiet, devastating cruelty of a world that simply looked away. The bell chimed again, this time with a sharp, unwelcome authority. Alara turned from the door, her heart sinking. It wasn't a customer. It was Marcus Sterling. He stood just inside, shaking rain from his expensive trench coat, a smile on his face that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a vulture in a cashmere scarf, circling the dying businesses of Oakhaven, promising revitalization while picking their bones clean. He surveyed the empty diner with an air of theatrical pity, his gaze lingering on the faded photographs of David in his army uniform that hung behind the counter. Sterling represented a different kind of storm, one that no walls could keep out. "Ilara, my dear," he began, his voice a silken weapon. "Still holding on, I see. Admirable in a futile sort of way." He slid onto a stool at the counter, the same one the rude tourist had just vacated, and ran a manicured finger over its surface, checking for dust. "What do you want, Marcus?" Ilara asked, her voice flat. She didn't have the energy for his games today. She picked up the tourist's dirty plate, the leftover meatloaf a cold, sad lump that mirrored the feeling in her stomach. "I want to help you," he said, leaning forward, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "This place, it has memories, I know. But memories don't pay the bills, do they?" He gestured around the empty room. "I'm prepared to make you a final offer, a generous one, considering the circumstances. Enough to get you a small apartment in a nicer town, a fresh start. Leave all this?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Behind." The offer was the same as before, an insultingly low figure that was a fraction of what the property was worth. He wanted the land for a luxury condominium complex, a sterile glass box that would block out the sun and cast a permanent shadow over the town. He called it progress. Ilara called it erasure. "The anchor is not for sale," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She turned her back to him, beginning to wash the plate with methodical, deliberate movements, scrubbing away the remnants of the day's humiliations. Sterling's smile vanished. The pretense of civility fell away, revealing the predator beneath. "Don't be a fool, Ilara. Your husband is gone. He's not coming back to save you." The mention of David was a deliberate cruelty, a precise jab at her most vulnerable point. "This diner was his dream, maybe, but it's your nightmare. The electrical is shot, the plumbing is a disaster, and you haven't turned a real profit in 2 years. I've seen your books. The bank has been very cooperative." A cold dread washed over her. He had been digging, prying, turning the screws in places she couldn't see. "You have no right," she whispered, her hands still in the soapy water. "I have every right," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "This town needs to move forward. It can't be held hostage by the sentimental delusions of a grieving widow. I will have this property, Ilara, with your signature or without it. You can take the easy way or you can take the hard way. But either way, I win." He stood up, his tall frame looming over her. "I'll give you until the end of the week to come to your senses. Don't make me get unpleasant." He dropped a business card on the counter next to her. It lay there, a white rectangle of pristine menace, before he turned and strode out of the diner, leaving the door to swing shut behind him, the bell chiming a final, ominous note. The silence he left behind was heavier than before, filled with the weight of his threats and the bitter truth of her isolation. Ilara stood at the sink long after he was gone, the water growing cold around her hands. She dried the plate and placed it carefully on the rack, her movements slow and automatic. Her gaze drifted back to the photographs of David. One showed him in his dress uniform, young and proud, his eyes full of a future he would never see. Another, her favorite, was of him standing right where Sterling had stood, covered in sawdust, a wide, triumphant grin on his face on the day they finished building the counter. He had planed the thick slab of oak himself, sanding it until it was as smooth as river stone. "This is the heart of the place, Ellie," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is where we'll welcome everyone. It's our anchor." He had come back from his last tour a different man, quieter, with shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The war had taken something from him, a piece of his light, and he'd fought every day to find his way back. Building the diner had been his therapy, his salvation. Every nail he hammered, Every board he laid was an act of reclamation, a defiant stand against the chaos that had threatened to consume him. He poured all the love and hope he had left into these four walls, creating a sanctuary not just for them, but for anyone who needed a warm meal and a kind word. It was his legacy, a testament to the fact that even after the deepest wounds, a man could still build something good and lasting. She walked over to the counter, her fingers tracing the faint grain of the wood. She could almost feel the phantom warmth of his hands, hear the echo of his laughter. Sterling saw a dilapidated building on a valuable piece of land. He saw rotting wood and failing profits. He couldn't see what she saw. He couldn't see the love, the sweat, the desperate, beautiful hope that was mortared into the very foundations of the building. Selling it wouldn't be a fresh start. It would be the ultimate betrayal. It would mean that his fight, his struggle to build a life after so much destruction, had been for nothing. It would mean letting the darkness win. Her grief was a physical weight, a constant ache in her chest, but it was also a source of strength. It was a promise she had made to him in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, a promise to keep his light alive. She straightened her shoulders. Let Sterling come. Let him do his worst. The anchor wasn't just a diner. It was sacred ground, and she would not abandon it. She would stand her ground, just as David had taught her. Sterling's unpleasantness began the very next morning. Elara arrived before dawn to find the front window shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a single point of impact where a brick lay on the floor amidst a spray of glass. The message was clear, brutal, and cowardly. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she swept up the shards, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the dustpan. Later that day, a different kind of assault. A sleek black car pulled up, and a man in a crisp suit, a health inspector, stepped out. He carried a clipboard like a weapon and wore an expression of grim satisfaction as he moved through her kitchen, pointing out non-existent violations. A complaint had been filed, he said vaguely, about unsanitary conditions. He slapped a temporary closure notice on her door, the bright orange paper a badge of shame. The community's response was a wall of impenetrable silence. As Elara boarded up the broken window with plywood, Mr. Henderson from the hardware store watched from his own doorway, his face impassive, before turning away to rearrange a display of hammers. Mrs. Gable, the town's most notorious gossip, hurried past with her head down, pretending to be fascinated by the cracks in the pavement. They knew. Of course, they knew it was Sterling's work. They had seen his methods before with the old bookstore and the family-owned pharmacy. They knew and they were afraid. Their fear was a tangible thing, a fog that settled over the town, choking any impulse toward courage or solidarity. They averted their eyes when she passed them on the street, their silence a form of complicity that felt sharper than any insult. Elara endured. She cleaned the kitchen from top to bottom, scrubbing until her knuckles were raw, satisfying every ridiculous demand of the health inspector until he was forced to grudgingly remove the notice. She couldn't afford a new pane of glass for the window, so the plywood remained, a dark, ugly scar on the face of her diner, making it look even more derelict and abandoned. Her suppliers, one by one, called with flimsy excuses. A truck had broken down. A shipment was delayed. She knew it was Sterling, pulling strings, cutting her off, trying to starve her out. She adjusted the menu, making do with what she could buy from the local grocery, her offerings growing smaller and simpler each day. She was an island, completely and utterly alone, the tide of Sterling's malice rising around her. Some nights, she would sit in the dark, empty diner, the weight of it all pressing down on her, and allow herself to cry. But when the sun rose, she would wipe her tears, put on her apron, and open the door. Her resilience was a quiet, stubborn flame in the face of a hurricane, a refusal to be extinguished. She was still standing. For David. For herself. The end of the week arrived with the same gray, relentless rain. The plywood over the window made the diner's interior unnaturally dark, the few lights casting long, distorted shadows. It was just past noon, and only a single family occupied a booth in the far corner, a young mother and her two small children, all of them looking tired and hungry. Alara had just served them plates of grilled cheese sandwiches, the last of her bread and cheese, when the bell above the door jangled violently. Marcus Sterling filled the doorway, and he wasn't alone. Flanking him were two large men with thick necks and dead eyes, their cheap suits doing little to hide their brutish frames. They were professional intimidators, and their presence sucked the remaining warmth from the room. Sterling's smile was a triumphant sneer. He strode to the center of the diner, his footsteps loud and arrogant on the worn floor. "Well, Alara," he boomed, his voice intended for everyone to hear. "Time's up. I trust you've come to your senses." He didn't wait for an answer. He gestured dismissively at the boarded-up window. "Look at this place. It's a disgrace. An eyesore. You're dragging the whole town down with you." The young mother in the corner flinched, pulling her children closer. Alara felt a surge of protective anger. She placed herself between Sterling and the family, her small frame a surprisingly solid barrier. "This is a private establishment, Marcus. Get out." Just then, the door opened again. It was the crying woman from the other day, the one who had run to the bikers. Her name was Maria. Her eyes, red-rimmed and fierce, locked onto Sterling. "You monster!" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You did this to my father's bakery. You threatened him until he had a heart attack. You're a thief and a bully." One of Sterling's thugs took a step toward her. "You need to leave, lady," he grunted, reaching out to grab her arm. He shoved her hard. Maria stumbled backward, crying out as she hit a table. Something inside Alara snapped. The fear, the exhaustion, the grief. It all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear resolve. She moved without thinking, stepping directly in front of Maria, placing herself between the woman and the advancing thug. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a threat. She just stood there, her chin held high, her eyes locked on the man's. Her stillness was more powerful than any shout. The thug hesitated, momentarily thrown by this small, quiet woman who refused to be intimidated. In that charged silence, Alara turned her back on Sterling and his men completely. She walked over to the family's table. The mother looked up at her, her face pale with fear. Alara gave her a small, reassuring smile. She picked up the check she had left on their table and tore it in half. "Your meal is on the house," she said, her voice steady and clear, loud enough for everyone to hear. No one goes hungry in the Anchor. It was an act of profound defiance. With her business on the brink of collapse, with threats looming over her, she chose compassion over fear, generosity over self-preservation. It was a declaration that Sterling and his world of greed and intimidation had no power here. In the heart of her husband's diner, other values reigned. The air in the diner grew thick and still. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, twisted into an ugly snarl of disbelief. He had expected tears, begging, surrender. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable dignity. The two thugs exchanged a confused look, their simple playbook of violence and intimidation momentarily useless against an opponent who refused to play their game. The mother in the corner booth stared at Alara, her eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous respect. She had been invisible, a bystander to the town's slow decay, but in that moment, she saw something extraordinary. Outside on the rain-slicked street, a few people had stopped, drawn by the raised voices. Mr. Henderson stood frozen in the doorway of his hardware store, a wrench in his hand. The librarian peered over the top of a book display. They had all been witnesses to Alara's slow, grinding persecution, and their silence had been a heavy shroud. But now, as wordless news of the confrontation inside trickled out, something in their posture changed. The slump of fear was replaced by a straightened spine of curiosity. Then something more. Whispers started, skittering from doorway to doorway like dry leaves in a storm. "Did you see her face? She's not backing down. He brought thugs with him this time. She just stood right in front of them." It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The collective gaze of the community, once averted in shame and fear, was now fixed on the diner. They were no longer just looking. They were seeing. They saw not a failing business owner or a lonely widow, but a woman of immense courage, making a stand not just for her property, but for the very soul of their town. Their shared guilt began to curdle into a nascent, unfamiliar feeling of shared responsibility. They had let Sterling pick them off one by one, believing his cancer wouldn't spread to them. But Alara's quiet defiance held up a mirror to their own cowardice, and they did not like the reflection. Sterling, sensing this shift in the atmosphere, felt his control slipping. He thrived on fear and isolation. This budding solidarity, this flicker of communal respect, was a threat. He took a step forward, his face flushed with rage, ready to escalate, to break her spirit with his bare hands if he had to. But before he could act, a low, guttural rumble started in the distance, a sound that was less heard than felt, a vibration in the bones and in the cracked pavement of Main Street. The rumble grew exponentially, a deep-throated growl that swelled into a thunderous roar, drowning out the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of hearts. It was the sound of dozens of powerful engines, a mechanical beast awakening. Heads turned towards the end of the street. Cresting the hill was a wave of metal and leather, a phalanx of motorcycles that seemed to blot out the gray sky. The Hell's Angels. It wasn't the small group from before, but what looked like the entire chapter, maybe more. They poured into Main Street, a river of polished chrome and black steel, their headlights cutting through the gloom. They moved with a terrifying, disciplined precision, filling the street from curb to curb, an overwhelming force of nature. They brought their bikes to a halt in perfect formation, the synchronized kick of dozens of kickstands hitting the asphalt sounding like a single percussive crack of thunder. The engines were cut, plunging the street into a sudden, shocking silence that was more intimidating than the noise had been. Doors opened on their bikes with a unified, metallic clatter. The bikers dismounted, a legion of giants in scarred leather vests, their faces hard and unreadable. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their sheer presence was a statement, a tectonic shift in the town's balance of power. Sterling's thugs, who had seemed so large and menacing moments before, now looked like frightened children. They unconsciously took a step back, closer to their boss. The bikers formed a silent, unmoving perimeter around the anchor, their broad backs creating a human wall, a fortress of leather and muscle. They stood facing outward, a clear message to the town, to Sterling, to the world. This place was now protected. The leader, a man with a thick, graying beard and the calm, steady eyes of a seasoned general, swung his leg over his bike and began to walk towards the diner's entrance, his heavy boots marking a slow, deliberate rhythm on the wet pavement. The bell above the diner door chimed, a sound so small and gentle it was almost comical in the face of the man who had just entered. He was tall and broad, his leather cut, adorned with patches that told stories of miles and years. He was the one they called Preacher. He walked past Sterling and his thugs as if they were pieces of furniture, his gaze fixed on Alara behind the counter. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. The onlookers outside pressed closer to the windows, their fear now mixed with a thrilling, terrifying awe. Preacher stopped at the counter, removing his leather gloves with a slow, deliberate motion. He placed them on the smooth oak surface, his calloused fingers resting near where David's hands had so often been. When he spoke, his voice was a low gravel, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes, surprisingly clear and intelligent, meeting hers. He nodded towards Maria, who was now standing safely behind Alara. "Maria is my sister." A collective gasp rippled through the small audience. Sterling's face went pale. "We've been hearing stories about this town for a while now," Preacher continued, his voice never rising but carrying to every corner of the room. "Stories about a vulture buying up history and scaring good people out of their homes. We don't like vultures." His gaze flickered towards Sterling for a fraction of a second, a look of such profound contempt that Sterling physically recoiled. "We sent Maria to see what would happen, to see if there was any fight left in this place. We watched from the edge of town. We saw her run to us, and we saw everyone else hide. His eyes swept over the faces of the townspeople pressed against the glass. His look a quiet indictment of their inaction. "Everyone but you," he said, his focus returning to Alara. "You stood in your doorway. You watched. You cared. And today you did more than care. You acted." He leaned a little closer, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal. "I looked into the history of this place. The Anchor, built by Sergeant David Miller. At the mention of David's name, Alara's breath caught in her throat. "I didn't know him well," Preacher said. "Different platoons. But I knew of him. They said he was a quiet man. A good man. A man who always stood his ground, no matter what. He built this place with his own hands after he came home." He gently tapped the oak counter. "This is good wood. Strong. Lasts a long time." Just like a man's principles, he looked directly into Alara's eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a threat, but a deep, resonant understanding. "Our brotherhood, we look after our own. That includes the legacies of honorable men. You, ma'am, have honored your husband's legacy. And now, we're here to honor you." The recognition began not with a cheer, but with a quiet, decisive turn of Preacher's head. He looked at Sterling, his expression unreadable but his intent perfectly clear. "Leave," he said. The word was not a request. It was a judgment, a final verdict delivered with the weight of the 30 men standing outside. "Get out of this town, and don't ever come back. If we see your face here again, or hear of you bothering anyone else, we will become unpleasant." He used Sterling's own word, turning it back on him like a sharpened blade. Sterling, his face the color of wet chalk, practically scrambled out of the diner, his 2 thugs stumbling after him like frightened dogs. The town watched as their tormentor was vanquished, not by a committee or a lawsuit, but by a force of raw, undeniable justice. Then Preacher turned to his men. He gave a short, sharp nod. The bikers moved with purpose. The silent perimeter broke, and they descended upon the diner, not as a threat, but as a restoration crew. One man, a giant with hands the size of dinner plates, gently began removing the plywood from the broken window. Another produced a toolkit and started measuring the frame for a new pane of glass. 2 others went outside, their deep voices rumbling as they discussed how best to scrub the graffiti from the brick wall. It was an astonishing, surreal sight. These fearsome men, symbols of outlaw culture, now working with the careful precision of master craftsmen to heal the wounds inflicted on this small, humble diner. Preacher reached into his vest and pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills, held together by a simple rubber band. He laid it on the counter. "This should cover the damages," he said. "The rest is for the house. Cook whatever you've got. Feed anyone who comes in. Today, no one in Oakhaven pays for a meal." He then turned to the silent, watching townspeople. "The Anchor is under our protection now," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "That means this whole street is under our protection. You look out for her, and we'll look out for you." That was the spark. Mr. Henderson, the hardware store owner, seemed to break from a trance. He disappeared into his shop and returned moments later carrying a brand new sheet of plate glass, offering it to the bikers with a nod of profound respect. The baker arrived with fresh loaves of bread and pastries. Mrs. Gable, her face flushed with a shame that was slowly being replaced by resolve, began wiping down tables. The community, once fractured by fear, began to knit itself back together around the Anchor. The diner, once a symbol of isolation, was suddenly the heart of a town rediscovering its courage. The bikers didn't just fix a window, they repaired the spirit of Oakhaven. A week later, the rain had passed, and a fragile autumn sun cast a warm, golden light over Main Street. The Anchor was unrecognizable. The new window gleamed, the graffiti was gone, and a fresh coat of paint made the old sign look bright and hopeful. Inside, the diner was alive. Every booth was full, the air thick with the sounds of conversation and laughter, the smells of sizzling bacon, fresh coffee, and cinnamon rolls. Alara moved through the bustling room, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in years. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. The people of Oakhaven, her neighbors, now met her gaze with warmth and respect. They had not only helped rebuild her diner, but in doing so had rebuilt their own sense of community. They had stood by silently while she suffered, but her courage had given them a second chance, and they had taken it. The bikers were gone. They had left as they had arrived, with the rumble of thunder disappearing over the horizon. But their presence remained, an indelible mark on the town's soul. On the stool at the end of the counter, David's favorite spot, rested a single powerful symbol. It was Preacher's cut, the heavy black leather vest with the fierce, winged skull of the Hell's Angels emblazoned on the back. He had left it for her before they rode out. A reminder, he'd said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. You're not alone. It was a shield, a trophy, a permanent declaration of allegiance. It told the world that this small diner, this quiet woman, was protected by a brotherhood bound by a code of honor that ran deeper than law. Alara paused in her work, her hand resting on the worn leather of the vest. She felt the weight of it, the history, the promise. She was no longer Alara Miller, the forgotten widow. She was the woman who stood her ground. She was the keeper of the anchor, a sanctuary built by love and defended by loyalty. In the distance, carried on the crisp autumn wind, she thought she could hear it, the faint, phantom roar of motorcycles on a faraway highway. It was no longer a sound of menace or fear. It was a lullaby of respect, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful armies don't fight for money or land, but for a simple, quiet thing called dignity. And in Oakhaven, dignity had won.